Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my review of the Fujinon XF 56mm F1.2. This is the RWR edition. Now, I did my review of the original 56mm F1.2 R lens back in 2019. It was 4 or 5 years old at that point. And at that point, I really lamented the fact that there was areas where it just really wasn't competitive, and lamented the fact that at that time Fuji was a closed platform, and as a byproduct the lens didn't really have any kind of competition outside of other Fuji lenses. And so as a byproduct I felt like there was areas where Fuji wasn't being pushed in their development. Fast forward to 2024 and this particular lens, and now there's a plethora of 56mm options on Fuji. They've opened up their platform, and I did a quick count and came up with 7 autofocusing 56mm lenses from third-party brands now available in Fuji X mount. And that's not including the few options that are available from Fuji themselves at this point. So clearly it's a very different market in 2024, which means that this lens has to compete on its merit. Now, the first thing that jumps out of you if you're looking at this lens versus a number of these third-party alternatives is it is expensive. It's a lot more expensive than any of those. So with that in mind, why is it that I'm so desperate to add one to my own kit after doing my review, even though it is in some cases 4 or 5 times more than what some of the very good competing lenses are? Well, that's what I hope to explore with you today as a part of this review, which we'll dive into right after a word from our sponsor.
Today's episode is brought to you by the Fantom Duffel, a new, unique convertible duffel bag that starts as a compact, packable case that easily fits into your luggage or carry-on bag, but then converts into a 35-liter duffel. The exterior is made of 1680D ballistic nylon, which is tough and weatherproof. The interior has a high-visibility reflective finish that allows you to easily see what's inside, even in a dim hotel room. A large foam pouch on the side has a cable pass-through to allow for charging, and the removable straps use a fidlock system to easily and securely connect them. I've been using it for the gym, and it has room for my water bottle, a change of clothes, a basketball, my massive shoes, a towel, and a charger for my cell phone. Visit store.phantomwallet.com to check it out and use code DUSTIN20 for 20% off when you're ready to check out.
So there's a reason why there are so many new 56mm lenses on the market, and that is because 56mm with a 1.5 times crop factor, as we've got on Fuji's X-mount cameras, is about 84mm in full frame equivalency. So essentially an 85mm perfect portrait lens. And that remains maybe the most popular portrait focal length that is out there. And so if portraits are a part of what you're wanting to do, or in this case, because of some improved versatility, the ability just to have a multi-purpose lens that can really give you subject separation can be a really tempting thing. And so I think that is a big part of why this lens is so popular. Now, one of the things that I criticized on the previous edition lens is it was a $1,000 premium lens that did not have weather sealing, whereas some of their much less expensive lenses, $300 or $400, did have weather sealing. It didn't make any sense to me. Obviously, it didn't make sense to Fuji either, because they've now corrected that here. This is R, which stands for the aperture ring, which is pretty much a constant on Fuji lenses, but it also has WR, which points to the fact that it has weather resistance. In this case, that's not just a gasket at the lens mount. Fuji says there are 9 different seal points throughout the lens itself, plus a fluorine coating on the front element, making this a thoroughly professional grade lens that you can continue to use even if the wind or the weather begins to turn a little bit foul on you. And of course, I live in Ontario, Canada. The weather often turns foul around here, so it's a really handy feature to have, obviously. Now, this lens has grown a bit, and if you look at it, kind of depending on which direction you're comparing it with, if you compare it to, say, the recent f1.8 and f1.7 56mm lenses that I've reviewed, it looks pretty big. But if you compare it to something like the Viltrox Pro AF 75mm f1.2, well, it looks quite a bit smaller. Truth of the matter is that the only kind of direct competitor is the Sirui Sniper 56mm f1.2, and it's not quite as squat or wide as this lens, but it is considerably longer, and it weighs basically the same within about 20 grams. And so this lens has grown some, but it's certainly not unreasonably large for an f1.2 lens. So this lens is 79.4 millimeters in diameter and a little bit less, 76 millimeters in overall length. That's 3.1 inches by 3 inches. It weighs in at 445 grams, just right under a pound. It's grown from 62 to 67 millimeter front filter threads. To me, that's a welcome change, unless of course you're upgrading from the previous edition lens and already have filters for it, because 67 millimeter filters are far more common than what 62 millimeter filters are. The end result of the changes here is that the lens has a profile that's a little bit more squat. It flares out a little bit more, and frankly, it's the kind of lens that I think actually looks really great on a camera. Your mileage may vary, obviously, but it's one of my favorite lens profiles to have on a lens, that nice squat prime lens that looks like you're a, serious photographer. Now, there is only that one f1.2 alternative. There's lots of 56 millimeter lenses now. A few of them are f1.4, but only one other f1.2, and that's the Sirui Sniper 56 millimeter that I referred to already. We'll see in our image quality breakdown, but this lens destroys that Sniper lens. If you're interested in optical quality, there's just no comparison here. This lens is far, far better. Now, I do have a critique in that, 10 years have passed since the launch of the first lens, and really, in terms of the external features on the lens itself, we have nothing new. I don't like seeing kind of that stagnancy in Fuji's lens development. We do have the aperture ring as we had before, but there's no new options with it. During that time, cameras have become much more hybrid focus. Fuji's own cameras, I'm shooting on the XH2. It's a great video body with options up to 8K video. But we have no concessions to the fact that people might want to do aperture racking, for example. No features like that, no custom buttons on here that would allow you to program different functions and to make the lens a little bit more versatile. No, we've got that aperture ring and that's it. And so I do have to knock them on that, because what I see from a bunch of other brands at this point is a whole lot more development in terms of the feature sets that are available on them. Now, one feature that is improved here is that this is the first XF mount lens to grow from a total of 9 aperture blades up to 11 aperture blades. And it is a beautiful aperture here. Stays very circular, as you can see from the aperture itself. And that plays out really nicely, because at f1.2, there is a little bit of that cat eye deformation towards the edges of the frame. You stop the lens down a little bit, and because that aperture is so round, the specular highlights are just beautifully round all across the frame. As you can see here with these raindrops at f2 and then f2.8, it looks really fabulous. So kudos to them for making that improvement there. It does come with the lens hood here, and as you can see, it is a big lens hood. So, the only kind of downside here is that it really does add in, it's basically about 2/3 of the length of the overall lens itself, which means that the lens length grows considerably when you have that lens hood attached. So you may prefer to use it, but there may be a lot of situations where you prefer not to use it and to keep the lens more in its bare shape. Now, the manual focus ring is a bit of a contradiction. It's a contradiction in the fact that the lens, or the ring itself, feels fine, has nice damping to it, but unfortunately, as we're going to see in just a second, the focus motor here is still rather primitive. And unfortunately, that plays a big part in the actual manual focus experience as well, since mirrorless lenses are what's called focus by wire. So the focus input from the focus ring, you'll note that there's no mechanical hard stops, you just rotate it endlessly. Because when the lens is powered down, that focus ring is doing nothing. When the camera is powered up, it means that that input here is going to be running through the camera and then to the actual focus motor that makes those minute adjustments. And so as a byproduct, because the autofocus motor is kind of rough, you can really feel pulses and it makes noise as you're moving it. And so by no means you're going to think that you're actually using a manual focus lens here. The focus simulation is rather on the poor side. And unfortunately, the far less expensive TT Artisan 56mm f1.8 that I reviewed a few weeks ago has a much nicer manual focus emulation than what this lens does, which is a shame since this is the premium lens in the class. Now, one final thing that is improved is that the previous version of the lens had a rather dismal 70 centimeter minimum focus distance and a very low 0.09 times magnification level. This lens is much improved in that regard. Not only can it focus a lot closer, it can focus down to 50 centimeters, so the magnification grows to 0.14 times, that's at the high end of any 85mm lenses that non-macro 85mm lenses that I've tested. So that's great. That's very competitive, but even more importantly, up close, the lens remains remarkably good. Even at f1.2, it is sharp, has good contrast, and so that just adds to the versatility of the lens. There's a lot of additional shots you can get with this lens that you really couldn't with the previous edition lens. So kudos to them on that. So let's shift over to autofocus. And as I've already hinted at, this is going to be my least favorite section in doing this review. Unfortunately, they have utilized an old style DC motor. And for some reason, Fuji can't seem to marry both large aperture with a linear focus motor, a smoother, more modern focus motor. We saw the same thing with the 50mm F1.2 that, you know, it's this very expensive high-end lens and it's got this very primitive autofocus motor in it. Same is unfortunately true here. I really hate this because I see from so many other brands, they're capable of doing so much more. You know, and on the full frame platforms that I test, I mean, they're large aperture lenses like this. You can use them for sports because they've got multiple, you know, linear style focus motors and focus is zippy. That's just not true here at all. And so unfortunately, it's quite noisy in operation. You can definitely hear, you know, whirring and clunking as it kind of moves along. And on top of that, it has this very obvious kind of double clutch action where the initial focus, if you shift from one focus point to another, it'll focus about 2/3 of the way. There's a pause, and then it does another, like that second clutch action where it kind of completes and finalizes focus lock. And so that does slow autofocus down, as you can see here. To counterbalance that, I did actually have really good focus accuracy with the lens. So it's not smooth, it's not fast in the way it gets there, but it is accurate at the very least. And so I found that I got very good accuracy with just general purpose shooting. It was excellent in terms of focus accuracy during multiple portrait sessions and in different kinds of settings. I was able to get very good lock on the eye, good focus there. I found that even when it came to, when I shot some gulls on the beach in Myrtle Beach, I found that if I started off with focus lock, it would do a fairly good job of staying locked on there. If I didn't start off the burst with focus lock, it was not intuitive or fast enough to ever pick it up. And so you wouldn't want to try to acquire a moving subject on the move. But if you start with it and it's not moving too fast towards the camera, the motor is able to reasonably keep up, but just don't buy this for sports. It's simply not good for that. I also found that out at night, kind of walking around, that the lens did a good job of focusing even in low light conditions. Obviously, this is going to be one of the better performers in terms of how much light it can let into the focus system itself. And so that certainly helped. And so I did have good accuracy even in very dim conditions. If anything, things were worse on the video side of things. And unfortunately, I can't really separate the camera performance from the lens performance. And this is an area where Fuji is way behind a lot of the other brands that I test. When it comes to things like focus pulls and you know, video AF tracking, it's just, it's a little bit clunky by comparison to what I'm seeing from Canon, Sony. I'll soon be covering Nikon, and so I'll be able to comment a little bit more on that area as well. But unfortunately, in this case, while you can see from these focus pulls that they've detuned the focus speed to try to make the noise less obvious, so you can still hear it, but it is quieter, but it also means that it's quite slow, and you can also see some visible steps, including that kind of double clutch action where you're not going all the way from one focus point to another, but there's a pause along the way. And then even once it arrives there on the video side of things, I saw some little settling micro pulses where it still tries to refine focus a little bit further. When it comes to my hand test, while it did a reasonable job of going back and forth and locking on the proper thing, it was gradual enough and not reactive enough that even though I tried to move much slower than usual, there were times that I didn't get my hand, you know, out of the way or, you know, fast enough or vice versa. And so it didn't quite get focus all the way there before it needed to start changing focus again. And part of that, even though I was monitoring a bit from the front of the camera, it's that double clutch action that it seemed like focus had taken place, but it had only done kind of the first part of the focus action. So again, not great. There is one strength here relative to some of the older Fuji lenses that I've tested recently, and that was the fact that I saw when I was trying to do just a static shot, say of this, you know, people on the beach here, that it wasn't doing like this constant pulsing. It settled on focus and it stayed there. So at least that's one good thing to do. So maybe the kindest way that I can sum things up here is that while the focus experience was not particularly refined, it did at least get the job done most of the time. Now I'm glad to get that out of the way because this next section is one that makes me much, much happier. This is a beautiful optical instrument. 13 elements in 8 groups. 2 of those are aspherical. 1 is extra low dispersion element in there. However they did it with the optics, they did a fantastic job. This lens is so much better, in my opinion, than the previous lens that I felt was already starting to be outclassed, even on the 26 megapixel sensor. On this new 40 megapixel sensor, at wide apertures, I would not be pleased with it at all. I love this lens even at f1.2, even on this 40 megapixel sensor. It is way up near the top of my list of lenses to recommend that actually work on Fuji's new high resolution sensors. The MTF, as you can see here, it looks really, really consistent, even though they're using the much higher 45 line pair per millimeter metric there on the bottom than what, most cases lens manufacturers are using only the 30 lines pair margin. And so we're 50% higher here, and yet you're seeing a really, really strong result. And so that is fantastic. This is a lens that was actually designed for handling the sensor, and it really shows. When I was shooting side by side with older lenses, the images off of this lens just sparkled in a way that even if I didn't know what lens it was by seeing the information, I knew which lens that I had used. I knew it when it was this lens because the images just were so much better. So I'll give you a more thorough optical breakdown at the end of the review if you're interested in that, but here is kind of an overview of the basic stats here. I saw that when I tested for vignette and distortion, very, very little distortion. I used a -1 to correct just the tiniest amount, but if you didn't correct it, you wouldn't notice it. And it was about a +41 to correct for the vignette, which for an f1.2 lens is really, really low, just a little over a stop. So neither one of those things is going to be a factor. Frankly, I think that you'd probably really like the results for most of your portrait work if you left it uncorrected. I think that it would be just a nice amount of subtle vignette there, and a tiny bit of pin cushion distortion is actually flattering. It makes people look a little bit thinner, which typically they're happy about. And so really great metrics there. A fantastic job in controlling fringing. That was an area of weakness on the previous lens. This lens is amazing, and as a byproduct, it has fantastic micro contrast in situations where fringing and a lack of contrast would cause the image to really fall apart. I felt like this lens sparkled in some familiar situations where other lenses have been really outclassed. This lens did a great job there. It has fantastic wide open sharpness and very consistent, I found, across the frame. It's sharp in the center, sharp in the mid frame, it's sharp in the corners. If you look at a comparison to the Sirui Sniper 56mm f1.2, they're not even in the same ballpark, as you can see. I typically don't even compare lenses to the Viltrox Pro AF 75mm f1.2. It is so good that it makes most other lenses look bad. In this case, I knew that this lens was up to the challenge, so I did compare them. And what I found is that the lenses are comparable in the center, but I actually preferred the corner results from this Fuji lens. It's a little bit more consistent out there into the corners. So, I mean, that's fantastic. The fact that it is competing well with that Viltrox lens just shows how good it is. Stop it down a bit by f2, it's pen sharp even into the corners. You're going to see the typical diffraction pattern on a high resolution body like this, starting basically at f8. You start to see a degradation of image quality due to diffraction. You can see it more pronounced at f11 and strong at minimum aperture of f16. But frankly, this is the kind of lens that you don't really need to stop down unless you want to increase depth of field, because it really is just so good even from wide open. It's complemented by also having gorgeous bokeh. And there are some sharp, for example, the Sigma 56mm f1.4 is a very sharp lens, but I didn't love the quality of the bokeh. So I don't necessarily love the lens. I mean, sharpness is not everything, and frankly, in many cases, you really can't see sharpness the way that you can see the overall rendering of images in the way that they're shared, particularly on the internet. And so I find that this lens has a beautiful blend of great sharpness on the subject, great contrast there, but also really nice, soft bokeh. And really, it's only the best lenses that are able to achieve that kind of combination of elements. I found that the subject isolation was beautiful. I love the optical quality. The colors look fantastic. Fuji has great optical glass, and it shows here. Colors were beautiful, and it just had that sparkle due to having great contrast, great color saturations, and great amounts of detail, along with, if there was defocused area, beautiful bokeh in it. I also found the flare resistance to be quite good as well for a large aperture lens. So, I mean, Fuji knocked it out of the park, in my opinion, when it came to the optics of this lens. So as much complaints as I have about the autofocus, I am showering it with flowers when it comes to the optical performance. So in conclusion, there are some really compelling budget alternatives to this lens at this point. We've had a great amount of really good options that have come to Fuji, particularly in the last year or so. As mentioned, a lens like the Sigma 56mm F1.4 is very sharp and it's half the price. But in my opinion, none of them have the combination of the gorgeous sharpness and contrast, but then also that beautiful rendering that this lens has. The colors are special, the rendering is fantastic. This is the rare lens that sings on the 40 megapixel sensor from Fuji. And so I understand if you've got a tight budget, there are some great budget alternatives at this point. But if you're willing to save a little bit longer and spend a little bit more, this is the lens to get. It has that extra little bit of specialness that will make your images, I think, make you happy. And at the end of the day, that should be at least a big reason why we're buying gear, is to kind of produce the images that really reflect who we are as artists and photographers. And so for me, this is the one I'm personally interested in. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you want more information, you can either check out my in-depth text review that's linked in the description below. Also an image gallery is there, some buying links. And if you want a deeper dive into the optical performance, stay tuned right now, and we'll jump into it together.
So first of all, we'll take a quick look at that vignette and distortion. You can see here again, just the tiniest bit of pincushion distortion, very easy to correct for. A bit of vignette there, but nothing serious. As you can see, easily to correct for that. In the corners, no issue here, just a little over a stop. And obviously the profile is going to correct for that anyway. Now, an area of huge improvement from the previous generation lens is the control of longitudinal chromatic aberrations. And so this is a bit of a torture test that I often find, in that lenses often will show a lot of fringing in these situations. This little bit of green right here is about the worst that I can point to. In this area here, though, where I would expect to see some of the worst, I find that it's really, really well controlled. There's no fringing before the plane of focus and just that tiniest bit of green fringing later on. I found that also when I had, obviously the bright specular highlights here. If we look at these shiny surfaces here, there's just great contrast and detail. No issues with fringing there. If we reverse things around and I look at the front of my vintage SLR here, again, no fringing before and after that very shallow plane of focus. If we look at the edge of these specular highlights, no fringing there. All very, very clean. What that allows is, even up close, this lens is able to produce really beautiful micro contrast. And you can see here that the details of textures are able to really pop, which is just often not the case. This shot right here, this is in my backyard, so it's an easy place to return to. And this bit of lichen growing on this fallen pine tree. What happens is that there's just really high contrast and then some really hard edges. And I find that very often this looks like trash due to fringing and a lack of contrast. And you can see here, even at f1.2, that's fantastic. Likewise, when it comes to lateral chromatic aberrations near the edge of the frame, corrections are turned off here. You can see just the tiniest bit of fringing in a few spots. Nothing that you're ever going to see in a real-world image. This is more than 200% magnification, so no problems with that either. So all that bodes well for the resolution of the lens. And sure enough, in the center of the frame, this is at 200% magnification on that 40 megapixel sensor. This is some of the best results that I've seen for a large aperture lens. Very, very clean. Looking over here in the mid frame, looks good. Looking up into this corner, looks good. Looking down here, looks good. Looking into the right corner, it looks good. And of course, looking up into the upper right corner, also looks good there. This is a really, really consistent performance. I'll give you a little bit of a deeper dive into those two comparison points I mentioned. The direct competitor here is the Sirui Sniper 56mm F1.2. These lenses are just not even in the same ballpark. You can see, as I noted in my Sirui review, that it's almost like there's a smear of Vaseline on that, whereas the textures just pop by comparison from the Fuji lens. Anywhere you look, the degree of contrast and detail is just so much better. Look at the amount of kind of fringing along those black areas that are showing up, whereas it's just super clean on Fuji. Great job with this lens. So that allows me to directly compare it to the Viltrox Pro AF 75mm f1.2, which to this point has been one of the very, very best lenses that I have reviewed on Fuji's 40 megapixel sensor. In the center of the frame, I would say that the Viltrox has very slightly more contrast. You can see that the detail on, just look at the various whorls here, this stamp here, and even the lettering themselves. I would say that the Viltrox is slightly better in the center of the frame. I would also say that the Viltrox is better in the mid frame there. Looking down into the corners, I would favor the Fuji lens outside of maybe just this last little bit right here. You can see if you compare the door here and here. More detail on the Viltrox, but coming back a little bit from the edge in the zone here of the face, very clearly better on the Fuji lens. So that translates into a lot of great real-world performance here. And so here amongst the Spanish moss, you can see the little bit of new life coming. But look at how great the detail is here and contrast. Very, very little fringing to see anywhere in all of this. Really fantastic. This is an f1.2 portrait shot from a distance with bright light. I mean, you can't really control outdoor lighting conditions when you're just kind of strolling around. And you can see here that it's handled all of that without falling apart. We can see in the areas that are still in focus, for example, this falls in the same plane of focus, even right off in the corner, it looks fantastic. And then if we step back and look at the image as a whole, that defocused area just looks beautiful. It looks like a painting or a canvas or something. It doesn't look like a real-world shot. It is, in fact. At night as well, in high contrast situations, we can see here that if I look over here to the left side of things, it looks really good. Coming here close to the center, all of these bright lights that could become, smears of either chroma or fringing, you just don't see it. It's doing a great job. And while this isn't my typical chroma test, we can see coming back here for a moment that we're not seeing that chroma smear near the edge of the frame. Really strong performance. Now, if we stop down to f1.4, you can see that there is a slight improvement to contrast there. Also, you'll see a little bit of that here in the mid frame and a tiny bit in the corners, mostly just a little bit of brightening due to a little bit less vignette. Now, by the time we get to f2, we can see the contrast has improved even more. And now I would say significantly, if we pan towards this corner, you can see that the corners are looking really, really crisp at this point. Great improvements there. From f2 to f2.8, the gains are going to be much more moderate. From f2.8 to f4, we can see a little bit more of a corner boost. Now these corners are looking super crisp. And then from f4 to f5.6, again, just the slightest bit of contrast boost that is coming there. But at this stage, you're getting everything that you could possibly ask for. F8 is largely holding its own. Diffraction is just starting to take a little bit of the edge off of some of the details, but it's slight enough. Remember, we're looking at 200% magnification. You won't notice it here. It's not till you get to F11 that you really start to notice that softening effect due to diffraction, and it's strong by F16, as we can see here. I gave the lens really high marks when it came to its up-close performance. Some lenses fall apart when you get up close. This is at f1.2, and you can see it really still looks fantastic. That aperture iris is so nice and rounded, so you can see there's a little bit of that cat eye deformation at f1.2. By f2, because the aperture is so round, we can see that the bokeh specular highlights there, they're nice and round all across the frame, which is very useful if that's something that you value. The ability to isolate subjects, even when the background is fairly close. There's some people here at the table in the background. I wanted the focus to be on this donut, which, by the way, was amazing. But you can see the detail is beautiful there, the powdered sugar on it. You can see all of that detail. But then look how creamy the background is. I love that f1.2 aperture. I also love it for this kind of shot where I'm blurring out the foreground and trying to draw the eye through the layers of defocus to get to our destination. This is a hard kind of image optically because usually these lenses are optimized for a little bit closer. This lens is great all the way through. And here at f1.2, look at how beautiful that detail is there deep into the image. And that adds up to a really beautiful portrait lens. I really quite like the Viltrox 56mm f1.7 as a budget portrait lens, and I continue to feel like that's the case. And if you compare right here, wide open to wide open, you know, the Fuji is a little bit sharper, but not radically so. But your big difference is going to be here. As you look towards the background in various places, the Fuji is very soft, whereas the Viltrox, with its smaller maximum aperture, the background is going to be busier. And this is actually quite an optimal situation. The main background is quite far away. And so the closer the background is, the more the advantage will be for the Fuji lens and its f1.2 aperture versus the Viltrox here. I really love the colors and the contrast from the lens, and so it just means that wherever I look in the frame, you know, there's just great detail. The image as a whole looks great, but it also holds up under a close examination. All throughout the frame, you can see that the detail just looks fantastic. And finally, for real-world shots shooting into the sun, I was actually pleased with the amount of contrast that held up in that, the lack of any kind of flaring or glaring effects. It just looked really, really nice. Optically, this lens is top-notch.
So thanks for sticking around until the very end. I hope that this has helped you to have an informed opinion as to whether or not this is a lens you're interested in buying. Thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.